Hi, I'm excited to be able to teach Kierkegaard this semester. I love teaching Kierkegaard. He's my favorite philosopher, and here's a little finger puppet of Kierkegaard. This is from the Unemployed Philosophers Guild, and I guess Tangelo may come over here a little bit later. In the background here, I have the harbor of Copenhagen, and there we see the Little Mermaid, the famous statue of the Little Mermaid. She is the famed statue that Hans Christian Andersen, who is a contemporary of Kierkegaard, wrote a story about. And Disney, I think, has made at least one movie about it, if not a couple. And so I thought this would be an appropriate background for us. This is an introductory lecture. So I want to give you an introduction to the material that we are going to be focusing on in this course. I'll give another little miniature lecture here for you to view that really focuses on the questions of the syllabus, including your assignments, the papers, the presentations, and those kinds of things. But this is mostly about the information of Kierkegaard, the content about Kierkegaard. Our course is going to focus on a theme that I think is perhaps the central theme of Kierkegaard's authorship as well, and that is how to become a Christian in Christendom. Now, Kierkegaard thinks that people are often trying to make things easier, or at least they're promising to try to make things easier. And in fact, this is what I'm doing. I'm creating a lecture here that gives you an introduction to Kierkegaard because I think it will make it easier for you as you begin to have a little bit of an introduction to all of the different texts that we will be reading and give you a little introduction to him and his themes before we actually begin our conversations in our course. And while I wish that we could be in person and talking about Kierkegaard in person. I think things are communicated more clearly in person. I am grateful for the media here of being able to make a video so that you can watch it prior to class. And we can, do some different things than we might ordinarily do without the technology. So this course, as I said, is about, we're going to focus on the works that he's written that help us most in answering the question or addressing the issue that he has about what it means to become a Christian, how to become a Christian in Christendom. Christianity, he thinks, becoming a Christian is a very difficult task indeed, is a task that takes one's whole life. And becoming a Christian in Christendom is also a very difficult task, even more difficult, because of what he thinks is the monstrous illusion, the prodigious illusion that we are actually all Christians, and therefore we don't need to become Christians. More about that later. Kierkegaard is called the father of modern existentialism. You may have heard that when you've studied him in the past, or may have heard other people say that. Now, what does existentialism mean? What does that mean, modern existentialism? Well, it is often understood as an approach to philosophy that focuses on freedom and responsibility of the individual. And let me say that again. It focuses on the freedom and responsibility of the individual. Freedom, the responsibility of those choices that you make as you yourself individually make, not what someone else has made for you or that you're doing because the crowd's doing it. And then the individualism is a focus as well. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, existentialism, quote, may be defined, okay, Tangelo, may be defined as the philosophical theory which holds that a set of categories governed by the norm of authenticity is necessary to grasp human existence, end quote. Authenticity then, along with the freedom and responsibility of the individual to be authentic in their choices, doubting the norms that you've been given, and doubting those claims that have been assumed to be true, and even doubting whether or not, am I making the right decision or not? Because freedom brings with it anxiety. Kierkegaard wrote a whole book about that kind of existential anxiety or dread. So authenticity, freedom, doubt, questions of meaning and meaninglessness, all of these characterize existentialist philosophers and novelists. Some of you may have be familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre, or I know a couple of you at least are familiar with Albert Camus, because I know you've been reading The Plague in the midst of our plague. Eliot. Well, another way of getting at this nomenclature is that existentialism is an approach that to understanding human existence and experience that rejects essentialism. It rejects the assertion that humans have an essence that has been created or given at birth or conception, or in the heavens, or in the realm of ideas, and that either because of original sin, or the corruptions of physicality or matter, or the necessity of actuality in opposition to possibility or potential, has become damaged. This essence has become damaged, or it's lost its memory of the ideal. And in this essentialist approach, the goal of human life is to shed the crap that's gotten on it, or fix the corruption that has damaged and corrupted the soul, and thus return it to a perfected being. And often in Christian theology, this could happen in heaven, or eventually as one returns in life after life, in Hinduism or some of the Vedic traditions, to try to fix this. That's essentialism. Existentialism, on the other hand, argues that our essence is not predetermined. It's not given. It's not limited, it's not given. Rather, it's shaped and transformed. Who we are is shaped and transformed as we live. The decisions that we make and finding our own individual authentic expression of who we are, that's where we get our essence. That contributes to an essence, or that which is essentially who we are, an authentic being, Helene or Kierkegaard or Tangelo. And it ain't over until it's over. Existence then precedes essence, so that you don't know who you are absolutely until you're not anymore, until you've made all the decisions you can make. Seeking to become one's true self is a lifelong task. In other words, it ain't over till it's over. This aspect is particularly important as we study Kierkegaard, because he believes that we are each in the process of becoming a Christian. Even as we live toward this goal, it is a process toward it that is important to him. Kierkegaard seems, for philosophers as well as theologians, seems to be concerned with human existence. And philosophers and philosophy students often read him as that's his point, that's his goal. That the insights that he gives us, that he talks about, it's all about what it means to be human, how to live an authentic human existence. And typically that's what the existentialists are concerned about and have been concerned about. I think it's certainly a noble goal. How do we live an authentic human existence? This is where we will begin as well. But I give you fair warning. I'm going to borrow from one of Kierkegaard's often quoted aphorisms. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. We can't really know who we are now. We aren't done becoming yet. Now, as I said, Kierkegaard, hang on just a second, I'm going to pause this. Tangela wanted to come and say hello, so here she is. Kind of hard to see her in the background there, isn't it? You want to say hello, Tangelo? Okay. All right. So as we were talking about, Kierkegaard seems to be concerned with human existence. But in actuality, he's more concerned, or primarily, or essentially, or actually, authentically concerned with Christian existence. This will become clearer the more we read and discuss the struggle to understand him and understand what it means to be a Christian, or to become a Christian. I will argue that every book, every expression of his literary genius is communicating this truth. The truth is subjectivity. For subjectivity, he believes, is about the individual's relationship with God. This relationship, this stance before God, which he says is rightly a transparent ground upon which every individual must reckon to stand. This relationship, it structures and colors every other relationship to other people, to one's truth claims, to one's vocation, even to oneself. He talks about this in Sickness Unto Death. Sickness Unto Death, as the relating of the relation to itself. Note that this is a fluid relating. So it's not simply a relationship that Kierkegaard is highlighting in his analysis of what it means to be a self, but it is a fluid relating. So the different parts of the self relate to each other, and even that is self-reflexive. But we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. We'll begin, so for the first week that we meet, we'll begin after we talk about the syllabus and any questions you have about the course and all of that. We'll begin with what appears to be his writing about human existence. And we'll be reading selections from Either Or, one of his first and successful books. So I have these old versions, these old volumes of Either Or. So Either Or 1 and Either Or 2. They are old books. They're translated by Swenson. And the version that you will be reading is actually translated by Hongs. So you'll see it. Can you see it? All right, here. How about this? Okay, so here's Either Or 1, and here's Either Or 2. It's a fabulous little story, and you're going to only be reading a little bit of it because we'll be taking a selection that has been put onto now I've lost my video here. Okay, so I've got some things for you from Unpopularly that have been scanned for you to be able to read, because some of you might not want to go to the library, and it's easier to be able to have the selections of books that we're not reading the whole thing available on Popularly. So the library was kind enough to allow this to happen. You'll also actually notice that not only are these on Populi, but I believe that the book that they're taken from, which is The Essential Kierkegaard, is also available in on a database so that you can read the whole thing if you'd like. But so I selected a short section from Either Or. And by the way, Either Or, it's published okay, so Either Or is one of his first, it's his first published book. And it is published in 1843. And as you saw, he publishes it under a pseudonym, Victor Eremita. Both volumes are published under that pseudonym. But they are, one gets the impression that they are actually the papers from different persons. We often will characterize Either Or volume 1 as the papers from A, and volume 2 of Either Or as papers from B. And that will be more meaningful as we continue on. He publishes his own books, which means that he gets to name it whatever he'd like to name it. He has complete artistic control over what's published, when and how it appears, but it also means that he's paying for the expense of publishing itself. And for the most part, the books basically go in distribution in Copenhagen, perhaps a little bit further than that into other parts of Denmark, but very few, not until later does Kierkegaard enjoy a kind of anything like the world fame that he has now. Note at the same time that he's writing this book on Either Or, which is, it's his most successful, actually. People find it enjoyable to read. He's also writing books that are religious works, and they're published under his own name, written under his own name, and he calls these edifying discourses. And they read somewhat like sermons or devotional essays. Now, before we move too quickly, I just want to go over a little bit of Kierkegaard's life. He's quite the guy. Here's a gigantic book, the most recent, well, not the most recent biography. There's another biography that's just come out in the past year. I have not read that one yet, but I'll look forward to it. This one is quite detailed with a lot. It's written by a Danish scholar, Joachim Garf, who I've met, and he's very fun and knows a lot about Kierkegaard. Anyway, just to give you a sense, some sense of his life, because his life ends up being much more important to his thought and what he's doing in his authorship than even for most philosophers and theologians. I think one's life, the life of the theologian and the author, are often important, but they're particularly important in Kierkegaard's. Kierkegaard is, well, let's start with Kierkegaard's father. Kierkegaard's father's name was Michael, and he was married. No, he wasn't married yet. Let's not get too close, too ahead of ourselves. So when he was a young man, he lived in the Jutlands. So that's north in Copenhagen, north of. So Kierkegaard's father is born. I'm going to show you the screen. Let's see, how do I do that? Here we go. So you can see that this is a map of Denmark, and Copenhagen is, I don't know if can you see me what I'm doing? Oh, Copenhagen is over here close to Sweden on the eastern part of Denmark. The Jutlands are over here, and this is where a lot of the fjords and those kinds of things that you've probably heard of. that's where Kierkegaard's father is raised. And he is a poor goat herder. He's not particularly happy. He thinks he has a miserable life. And when he's still a fairly young man, he curses God for having such a miserable life. But soon after that, his mother's brother, who is an uncle who's a merchant, takes a liking to him and invites him to come and work with him. And so he ends up going to Copenhagen, and he ends up becoming a merchant, a clothes merchant, and a variety of different other types of merchants, and makes lots of dollars, becomes a millionaire, so to speak. And he's married early on, but his wife dies. And then he remarries, and he ends up remarrying a woman who was the household clean, the person who the live-in help, so to speak. And that woman is Kierkegaard's mother. Kierkegaard is very attached to his father. Kierkegaard is actually youngest of lots of brothers and sisters, mostly brothers. And his father is in his 50s by the time Kierkegaard gets to be old enough to talk to him. And they have an odd relationship. It seems to be characterized at first as Kierkegaard's father being rather strict. He's a pietist, so he's influenced by the Moravians, but he's very strict in his piety and his Lutheranism. And we'll get to that more later in what that might have looked like in the 1800s in Denmark. By the way, Denmark is Lutheran. It's then in particular, but all of Sweden and Norway, it's all very Lutheran. You remember Luther in Germany, and all the Lutherans, or Lutheranism, it characterizes most of Scandinavia. And let's see, I'm going to stop sharing now. So Kierkegaard grows up with a father that's rather strict, and he's also not really able to play very much with the little Soren. Yet they would have, when he would come home from work, Kierkegaard would want to go play or do something, and he would do it. He'd say, "Let's go for a walk in our minds." So early on, Kierkegaard learned to use his imagination to do different things. And they would also make up stories about people that they would see. Oh, what do you think that person's up to? And, you've probably seen that in other contexts, but, it contributed to a lively life of the mind for Kierkegaard. When he's young, Kierkegaard is known as the fork. He also fell out of a tree when he was young, and so he has a bit of a hunchback. You've probably seen drawings or cartoons of him with that hunchback. But he's called a fork because when people made fun of him, he was really good at getting them back using words. So he had a satirical, biting sense of humor, and did not take being made fun of lying down, so to speak. As Kierkegaard gets older, he meets Regina Olsen. And Regina Olsen is younger than him, maybe about 8 to 10, 12 years, somewhere in there. And but he courts her, and eventually they fall in love and they get engaged. And at first, Kierkegaard's Regina Olsen's father is not interested in Kierkegaard, but he decides that Kierkegaard's okay. And then Kierkegaard has something happen. So when he is about 22 to 25, he's got some things that happen. Sometimes he calls these the great earthquake in his journal, a great earthquake. And the great earthquake seems to be, Kierkegaard, by the way, he's a very indirect and somewhat secretive. He likes mysteries and secrets. He doesn't want to, I mean, this is in his journal. I suppose he knows what he's talking about because he doesn't, I think he probably knows that his journal will probably be published at some point because it's not written like Dear Diary. But it definitely gives us an insight into his work and his thought. Often he seems to be using his journal to test out things. Like he writes something and then it appears later on. Like he'll write a long piece and it'll appear later on in an essay. But in his journal, he talks about the great earthquake. Now, one of the great earthquakes is something that his father reveals to him. I don't know what it is. People have speculated. Anything from his father feeling guilty for his whole life because he cursed God, to something not quite conventional about Kierkegaard's mother or his birth or other people in his family. Something's not quite what Kierkegaard had expected, and he's quite shaken up by it. When Kierkegaard is, before this, Kierkegaard has been very distant and rebellious with his father. We'll talk more about that later when we get into Purity of Heart, which we'll get toward the end of the class. That's the name of the book. And, but when his father confides in him, he then becomes rather close to his father. And he admires his father and takes him as someone to emulate and someone whose truth is deeper than his own truth, which is saying a lot because Kierkegaard knows he's damn smart and he's got a lot to say and a lot to think. And usually he thinks everyone else is confused or wrong in some ways. But at any rate, so this happens. And then as that happens, just around the same time that that's happening, almost everyone in Kierkegaard's extended family, his brothers, his cousins, his father, dies, except for his oldest brother, Michael Peterson. He has a couple other nieces and nephews that stay alive, but he's convinced that he's going to die, I think. He also is depressed. He calls it his melancholy, which he gets from his father. His father also had melancholy, which I think the therapists in the room would say, maybe, you know, you'd have a different diagnosis of him, especially as you read his works. But he's, for whatever reason, he decides that he cannot marry Regina. Now, her father, having originally been a little bit, oh, no, we don't want you, Soren, then has become very attached to Soren as well. And Regina is very attached to Soren and begs him to reconsider and to not leave her. But Kierkegaard is insistent. And we get the impression that Kierkegaard, particularly when one of the things that he says is that I was an eternity too old for her. I don't think he means in terms of age. I think he's a very melancholic, serious young man, and I think he thinks that he's leaving her for her own good, for whatever reason that is. Either he thinks he's going to die soon because everyone else has died, or he thinks his melancholy will get the best of him, or he believes that as a philosopher or a parson, he really shouldn't be married. I'm not, we don't know. But so he breaks up with her. Then he goes to Berlin. He goes to Berlin. He studies with some Hegelians or post-Hegelians. I also have a Hegel one too, and I'll get that out. And I know that Elliot will particularly like the Hegel the Hegel one. They'll have little battles. But he doesn't study with Hegel, but he studies with people who study with Hegel. And he goes to Berlin a few times during his life. But he comes back almost as if something happened. Like it was a V8 moment where he now realizes that he doesn't have to give up Regina and that he can come back and that they can get married now. But she has gone off to be engaged with Schelling, who she knew before, and no dice, Soren. She's not going to go back with Soren. This is depressing for him. Depressing is the wrong word. This is devastating for him. And it seems to me that throughout his authorship, he's really often writing to her, hoping to get her attention. There is well, we can talk about that. No, I'll just say it. There's an incident that happens, like 10 years later, maybe 11, where he sees her at church. There's a church. They all go to the same church, which is really close to where he lives. Oh, I have that to share with you too. And he sees her, it's an Easter, and he has dedicated his work to her. But he doesn't say that it's dedicated to her. It's kind of about her, but it's all indirect or misdirected, as Kierkegaard likes to do. And so when he sees her, he sees her at the church, because I'm sorry, I forgot something first, that when Kierkegaard comes back, he wants to continue to be friends with Regina, but Schelling says, no dice. No, you're not going to go and hang out with my wife. It's not going to happen, Mr. Philosopher guy. So Kierkegaard is very sad. But so he has to communicate with her indirectly. So he sees her at church, and she nods at him. And then he nods back. And then she nods again. And then he nods again. And then he nods again. And that means a lot. That means she read his book. She understands that the book was about her and why he did what he had to do. And she forgives him. And she knows that he still loves her. And well, and that's written in his journal. So, he's got some issues, but he's a delightful author, and he does some really interesting things. In his Either Or book that I was just mentioning earlier, he starts off by, okay, so we're going to talk some more about Either Or. And, well, actually, we're done talking about Either Or. We're going to talk about the next book that we're going to read, and that is Fear and Trembling. So there's several versions of Fear and Trembling. Here is one. It is a hardback version. You probably have a simpler version. There's also a version that has both Fear and Trembling and Sickness Unto Death together. Where'd we go? There we go. Okay. This is one of the most popular books read by undergraduates nowadays. Personally, I think it's a little bit of an odd choice, but I can understand why philosopher professors particularly like to read it. It's fairly easy to follow, although I think it's difficult to engage very deeply. But it raises issues and questions of the relationship between ethics and religion, which are really important questions for people to think about, particularly in philosophy of religion. And faith appears on the surface in this book to be quite outrageous. In my opinion, I think undergraduate professors of philosophy often like to blow students' minds about their unexamined faith or religious affirmations, but that may be different these days. So this book raises several important questions and issues that are ripe for our discussion about what does it mean to have faith, and how is faith and your religious responsibilities, on the one hand, related to your ethical responsibilities. Immanuel Kant, Kierkegaard is writing in opposition to Immanuel Kant about this particular point, when that Kant believes that religion really is about ethics. It's about how to promote ethical behavior and ethical choices. So for Kant, there's two parts to a person's mind. No, two parts to a person's motivation. The first one part is what he calls the moral maxim. And the second one is self-interests and what works for me, what I want right now. And he believes that animals operate out of self-interest and instinct. People, he says, however, have this other maxim, this other motivation, this other way of organizing one's decisions. And the moral maxim for Kant is, I have a Kant, one of these too, but that one's at school. Oh well. The moral maxim says 2 points. There's 2 points to it. The first one is that one ought to treat other people as ends in themselves and never as means to get to your own ends. Seems good. The other one is the categorical imperative, and that we won't get into that. Let's just stick with this one. And when one behaves in a moral way, the moral maxim is the thing that's most important in your motivation, and then self-interest is second. But he thinks that people flip those when they sin and when they do immoral things. He thinks that's what original sin does. It flips those things, or it puts them even, and then one gets more important than the other, or the one that's not important gets out of whack. And he believes that religion, this is Kant, he believes the point of religion is to help people get that moral maxim back on top, so that they're motivated out of treating people as ends in themselves and never as means, and that one should never, this is the categorical imperative, actually I'm going to talk about that. The categorical imperative is that one should only behave in a way that everybody can behave in the same way. So that's a universalization of ethical decisions, that you're making an ethical decision if everybody did the same thing you're doing. So there's no taking into account situations. Like if it's wrong to kill, then it's always wrong to kill. What if everybody killed? What if everybody stole? What if everybody did that? That's Kant's categorical imperative, and those two things make up the ethical in his mind. Kierkegaard is very influenced by his understanding, Kant's understanding of the ethical, as it is related to the universal norms and rules and laws that everybody should follow. So this work raises questions about if there's any conflict, or if religious responsibilities actually do simply deepen or make ethical decisions clearer or simpler. For Kant, the Gospels have Jesus showing people what to do, and trying to get people to be motivated, so that Kant believes that most people don't think about these things. But if you thought about them and you were smart, then you could figure it out. But instead, you and most women, all women for Kant, actually can't figure it out, so they need to have these stories that motivate them. This is not simply a question of the 19th century. It's also a question that perhaps you might have. There was a movie once that I watched, and the question was, if you'd go back in time and kill Hitler before he became the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, would you? What would you do? What if you felt called by God to save the Jews and the Poles and the gay people and anybody else, the communists, all the people that Hitler killed? Would you suspend the universal ethic of not killing for religious purpose? This is a question Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually was faced with, and he chose to follow Kierkegaard's thinking when he participated in an assassination plot against Hitler. I have suggested, or I'm suggesting, that we address this text and its questions. The questions that center around this issue of what does faith mean, and is faith actually, and faith's responsibilities, does it call us to sometimes go against our ethical norms? I'm suggesting a creative approach to these questions. I've planned a debate. So each student will be assigned a question and a position to take, and then we'll play it out on Zoom. There are 3 problems or problema that Kierkegaard talks about. And I've created a sheet for you that has those questions and gives you detailed questions about how to help you answer those questions and prepare your debate. And I'll give you a handout, or I guess it's not a handout, it's a Zoom out, a Populi post that gives more details about that. But I hope that it will give you both the ability to focus on a particular section in greater detail, and to share the fruits of that greater detailed study, but I also hope that it will give you an experience of intellectual empathy. And, you know, it'll be a fun way to break up me talking all the time. So Fear and Trembling expands our engagement with Kierkegaard's theory of existence as well. So it's talking about, Fear and Trembling is focused on the difference between the religious and the ethical. So Kierkegaard has a notion of theory of existence as consisting in 3 spheres or stages or dimensions of existence. Each of these spheres are characterized by different values and different activities and ways of living. The first, the aesthetic, is exemplified in Either Or, volume A. The second, the ethical, is exemplified in Either Or, volume B. It's described even more fully in Fear and Trembling. The third, the religious, makes a brief appearance at the end of Either Or B, but is also further discussed in Fear and Trembling, exemplified by Abraham. I've written a book that explores Kierkegaard's view of the self in depth. And I have the purpose of utilizing in my book his insights in about what it means to be human in dialogue with a French feminist named Luce Irigaray. And it offers a constructive view of what it means to be human, and argues that being human is plural. There's a plurality within the self. A little bit like Kierkegaard, but it's more, my argument is a little more embodied and wider, I suppose. And it's relational. The self is relational. In it, I explain and develop Kierkegaard's spheres of existence, and we'll read that chapter to both examine and consider his theory in more depth. And we'll give it'll give a survey of several different perspectives, secondary literature, perspectives on understanding these spheres, and what did Kierkegaard mean to believe, how did Kierkegaard believe they were related to each other, and then how do we think they're related to each other? So I encourage you, by the way, to do research and read secondary articles and sources on these topics, including Kierkegaard and faith, his understanding of the spheres of existence, his understanding of Either Or, his understanding of Fear and Trembling, and the other texts that we're reading and other themes.